Good morning.
Good morning.
So back in the days when I was in seminary, I and the other Master of Divinity students took a Gospels class. It was our first foray into the Gospels 101. Now the professor split us up into 4 groups, and we each had to give a creative presentation on our assigned Gospel. Ours was Mark. And we decided we wanted to use story as our creative medium to share what we learned. You see, Mark's gospel is different from the others in that he was a storyteller, not a theologian. And he really wasn't very educated, but he had a goal in mind to tell the story of Jesus so that you didn't just know about Jesus, but that you knew Jesus and his message. So wanting to remain true to who Mark was, we titled our project, This Markian Life. It's a play on National Public Radio's This American Life, a radio program that comes on each week that tells stories based around a predetermined topic, and usually by those who experience them firsthand. We told the stories found in Mark as though we were the ones who were living them. For example, the parable of the fig tree in chapter 11 was told by a student who played a fig farmer and gave her testimony of the story as if she were actually there to watch Jesus curse a fig tree. Now, one of my other classmates told the story we have in front of us today of James, Jesus, John, not a parable, but an important moment when the 2 disciples got a little ahead of themselves. It was described as a story of Jesus kindly telling the disciples to sit down. Sit down and listen because you've missed the point. In colloquial terms, when people are having a conversation or maybe more of a debate, when someone says, sit down, it's because they need to be set straight for whatever reason. My classmate told it not in a way that made Jesus sound angry at their request, but in almost a soothing way, as if to say to the disciples, oh, bless your hearts. I think you might have missed something. So let's sit down together and talk about it. Starting back in chapter 8 before our story, Jesus had already explained his destiny to his disciples 3 times. So you would think they would have gotten the message of what was coming, but Mark tells us they didn't understand. Each time Jesus would predict his own death and suffering and resurrection, it went right over the disciples' heads. Now, in my mind, I picture Jesus and the 12 disciples walking along the road like a teacher and his students walking down the hall of a school, and suddenly James and John, like little children, break away from the others in line and run up to Jesus. Hey, Jesus, will you give us anything we ask? And maybe Jesus humors them a little. What is it you want me to do? As soon as the request is made, Jesus stops, causing the line of students behind him to come to a halt. Maybe a few steps back, Peter's like, hey, why'd we stop? And Matthew and Simon and Andrew look confused like children on a long car ride and start asking, are we there yet? And eventually all the disciples realize what James and John have asked, and they start to get angry by their request. And Jesus, instead of getting angry, realizes they don't get it. So now he's telling all of them to sit down, not just James and John. I think there's some things that need to be clear. Now at this point in the story, we also know what the disciples don't. We know that the, quote, glory of Jesus, that's the cross, and that the 2 men to the right and left of Jesus on the cross will not be James and John, but 2 thieves. Jesus is trying to say something more to them in response to their request. He's trying to explain to them that not only is it going to cost more than they can ever imagine to truly follow him, but that it's going to involve suffering and giving up their lives for God's people. Like those of us today, sometimes we get ourselves into situations and it turns out to be a little more than maybe we expected. And that's where the disciples were at. They didn't actually know what was in store for them because each time Jesus tried to tell them, they didn't understand. So I'm sure this isn't the first time you've heard this, but Christians in the biblical times, our disciples, they were people who were minorities, and they were people who were persecuted. Our scriptures were not written by people in positions of power. Our scriptures were written by those on the margins of society. Jesus was not a popular guy among those in political power, and he especially wasn't popular among the religious leaders. To be a follower of Christ meant you were part of an oppressed community. Being a follower of Christ was never going to be glorious in the eyes of the world, and it definitely was not about getting public recognition. In fact, early Christian worship was not done in public, but it was done in secret because of the persecution. When Tara and I were visiting Rome a few years ago, we went out to see some of the old catacombs, ancient burial sites underground where Christians would secretly meet. They knew openly practicing their faith could mean death. Now, Jesus was countercultural for his time, and I don't mean in the hipster way countercultural is today. No, he actively defied the political leaders with nonviolent means, and clearly some people listened to him, and because of that, he was a real threat. It wasn't a trend. That is who these disciples were following, and that's who we follow. Jesus was a revolutionary, and when you're part of a revolution, you often have to give up quite a bit in order to make change happen. In his last sermon titled The Drum Major Instinct, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. preached on this same text. His sermon speaks particularly to our human desire to be out in front, leading the parade. He argues that few of us are immune to this drum major instinct, and that we're more like James and John than we realize. We don't necessarily get it all the time, and like these disciples, he says, quote, we too have those same basic desires for recognition, for importance. So Jesus' response to King's drum major instinct was to redirect his disciples. He wanted them to understand and practice the same sacrificial discipleship that he taught and modeled in his own life and eventual death. It would be really easy to just dump on the disciples right now. Throughout his storytelling, Mark likes to paint the disciples as the bumbling idiots that just never get it. They're never good enough. And we could go along with Mark and just call the disciples what he wanted us to, or we could do like Jesus and see the potential in these disciples. And if Jesus saw potential in the disciples, that means we have the same, if not even more, potential to drink from the same cup and be baptized into the life that Jesus led. We too can practice the sacrificial discipleship that Jesus called for, and we don't have to become martyrs to do it. When Jesus had his sit down with his disciples, he didn't scold them, he redirected them. He didn't have to shed their drum major instinct, and he didn't ask them to. Instead, Jesus said, if you want to be great, and I know you do, then go and serve. Be the best servant to others. And if you want to be first, don't just be the best servant, be the best servant of all humanity. Be first in line. Be the servant to every person that you meet. Jesus was sent into the world to bring about a new, nonviolent order that would revolutionize the world and bring about the real possibility of peace and equality and love. And this is how he redirected his disciples to do the same, to be the best in love and service, and to do it in Christ's name not for yourselves, but for the rest of the world. And the thing is, when Jesus is telling the disciples this, we know they eventually do become martyrs. They paid with their lives for their faith and action. They didn't experience glory and prestige while they were here on earth. I think it's safe to say that we don't have to lose what the disciples ultimately did. We don't have to risk our lives to serve others and to practice our faith. We don't have to be countercultural to possibly lose our lives. But like the disciples, we also don't get the glory here on earth. It's not what it's about. It's not what we're called to do. Unlike the early Christians, we modern-day Christians, we're the majority. Of the entire world, 1/3 of all people claim Christianity as their faith. 75% of the population of the United States alone claims Christianity as their faith. The people who were in the majority in Jesus' time, the ones who were in power, they were the ones who oppressed the Christians. Well, now that we're the majority, how are we going to do it? How are we going to hear the message of Christ when we're no longer the minority? The world is clearly a much different place now, and we have the opportunity to still be like those disciples. But we have more resources than they could ever imagine. The possibilities, friends, are literally endless. So what does Jesus call us to risk as modern-day Christians? Well, again, the same as the disciples. Go and serve. It's actually pretty straightforward. Go out and serve with all the resources you have. Serve the entire world, every single person you meet, no matter how big or small the request. Remember that everything you do has an effect on others, and use the resources you have to exercise power on behalf of others, not over or against them. Jesus wants us to be the opposite from those who held power, from those who were the majority in his time. And what Jesus says to disciples, he says to us, you know, the ones who are considered the rulers by the non-Christians show off their authority over them and their high-ranking officials and order them around. But that's not the way it will be with you. No, you will not hold your power over others, but you will use it to care for the sick and the poor and the hungry and the tired and the persecuted of this world, and you can be the first in line to do it. I know you will. In mine and Tara's short time here, I've seen you do it over and over and over. That's what the whole church here is here to do. And the church as a system all over the world is meant to help people to do Christ's work. But let's not be martyrs here. Just because we do Christ's work doesn't mean we can't feel good about it. In fact, I think we should feel good about it. We aren't talking about getting that external notoriety that our drum major instinct seeks out. This feeling is internal. We should feel positive about it when we serve others, not because we get noticed or because we receive praise from others, but because when we fulfill what Christ has called us to do, we make a joyful noise in our own hearts, and that affects us. It molds our hearts a little more each time into the heart of a servant. In season 5 of the NBC hit show Friends, characters Phoebe and Joey argue about the topic of good deeds done in service for others. Joey believes there is no such thing as a selfless good deed. He argues that when you do something for someone else, that you feel better or you feel good about yourself. Therefore, making a good deed really one that is fulfilling for you, even if you're giving up something like money or time or resources, you will ultimately feel good about yourself. Phoebe argues that it is possible to do a good deed for someone that is completely selfless, but every time she or another character try to do something selfless for someone else, they ultimately feel good about helping another person. And Joey's right. Doing good deeds for others does make you feel good. When we serve others, it should feel good. It's not always easy, but knowing that we're doing what Christ called us to do should make us joyful. We aren't doing it for glory because we know that's not it. The disciples ask for that glory, and Jesus says, no, you're great when you serve in the name of Christ. Friends, this is not some new revelation. I don't bring you new news. But it's a reminder to each of us that when we have a moment like the one James and John have found themselves in here, when we start to seek that glory or want to know how to be the best in the world and get that notoriety, we look to Jesus to redirect us, to be the best disciple who serves everyone else, to be the drum major of servanthood, to be first in line to care for others, not for glory or for prestige, but because that's what brings about God's glory. And yes, it should make you happy, because that's what fulfills the life and teachings of Christ, and we should always rejoice in that. So go out, go be servants, go be the first in line, and go be the best servants. Amen.